Have you ever met someone who almost never expresses anger, but somehow every time you're around them, you become angry? You leave the interaction feeling irritated, maybe even a little combative, and you can't quite explain why, because they did not raise their voice, they didn't say anything cruel. If anything, they seemed calm, maybe even a little too calm, and something in you is activated. You are replaying the conversation, kind of feeling the heat rise in your chest maybe hours later. And the strange part is that when you try to point to the moment where it went wrong, you can't find one. Psychoanalysis has a fascinating concept. It's called projective identification. It's one of those ideas that when you first hear it, it sounds almost magical, like something is being transmitted between two people without either of them saying a word. And in a sense, that's not far from how it feels. But I want to be really careful here because it's easy to take this concept and turn it into something mystical, closer to like emotional telepathy. And that's not actually what it is. So before we go further, I want to make a distinction. Projective identification does not mean that people literally transmit an emotion into you the way you might beam a signal from one device to another. We're not reading minds or casting anything. So what happens is interpersonal, not paranormal. It happens through communication, just not the kind we usually pay attention to. Through tone, timing, that subtle pressure of a pause, withdrawal at exactly the moment you needed a response. Maybe some raised eyebrow, something in their voice, some shift in body language that you register before you can even name it. These are all forms of communication, even though we don't call them that in the moment. So the basic idea is that sometimes a person carries an emotion they cannot tolerate feeling themselves. Maybe it's anger, maybe it's helplessness or shame or fear. And for whatever reason, and reasons vary from person to person, this feeling is intolerable to them. They just can't feel it. And it threatens their sense of who they are, maybe, or it feels dangerous, or it was never safe to express. So instead of feeling consciously, they unconsciously behave in ways that induce that same feeling in the people around them. They are not announcing it, but they're creating the exact conditions that would make almost anyone in that position start to feel it too. Start to feel that anger in this case. So let's go back to the person who never seems angry. Picture someone who is very composed, reasonable, patient, maybe a little saintly in how they handle conflict. On the surface, this looks like emotional maturity, and of course, sometimes it genuinely is emotional maturity, but sometimes underneath that composure, there's enormous amount of anger that this person has never learned to feel or express because somewhere along the way it became unsafe or unacceptable for them to be an angry person. So the anger doesn't disappear, it goes somewhere, and one of the places it can go is into you. How does that actually happen in a real interaction? Well, it's not just one moment, it's more often a pattern of small things that accumulate. They might respond to a concern with a tone so calm, it feels almost dismissive and makes you feel unheard and invalidated, and you raise your voice slightly to be heard, which then allows them to appear even more reasonable by comparison with you. They might go quiet at exactly the point where you need engagement, and that silence is not neutral. It has weight. It can feel like withdrawal or punishment, or sometimes something in you starts to protest that treatment, sometimes before you even consciously registered what's happening. They might agree with you on the surface, while their body language tells a completely different story, and you find yourself getting louder and more insistent to close the gap between what they're saying and what you are sensing. None of these moves are necessarily conscious. That's important. This isn't usually about someone deliberately manipulating you into feeling angry. Most of the time, this is happening entirely outside their awareness. It's an old automatic pattern, probably one that formed long before you even entered their lives, and you simply stepped into a role that was already being cast. And that's really the heart of what makes this concept feel so strange and so powerful at the same time. It's not that they're making you angry the way someone might provoke you on purpose. It's that their unconscious way of being in the world creates a kind of emotional role, and something in the interaction pulls you toward feeling that role. You start to carry the anger that they cannot carry themselves. This is where therapists often encounter this concept most directly through something called countertransference. In a therapy room, a clinician sits with all kinds of people, and part of the training that we do is learning to notice your own internal reactions as information, not just as noise to push aside. So a therapist might be sitting across from someone who presents as calm, agreeable, even eager to please, and yet the therapist notices they're feeling unusually irritated or restless or strangely protective or maybe sad in a way that doesn't seem to match anything that was said in the room. And a well-trained therapist doesn't just dismiss that reaction as random. They get curious about it. They ask themselves, why am I feeling this with this particular person right now? Sometimes the answer really is that it's about the therapist, their own history, their own day, their own sensitivities. And of course, we always check that first. And sometimes when that reaction keeps showing up in a very specific and consistent way with a particular person, it starts to look like something else, like starts looking like information about what that person cannot feel or express themselves, what is being communicated indirectly through the relationship, because probably there was no other way for it to be communicated in any other ways. And this doesn't only happen in therapy rooms, it happens at work, with the colleague who never seems stressed while everyone around them is quietly unraveling. It happens in families with the sibling who stays eerily composed at gatherings while everyone else ends up snapping at each other. And it happens in friendships, romantic relationships, anywhere people spend enough time together for these unconscious patterns to have room to play out. Now I want to be transparent about something because I think it matters. Projective identification comes from psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis has a different relationship to evidence than, let's say, cognitive psychology or attachment research. I personally do not know of controlled experimental research of projective identification. Maybe it exists, I couldn't find it. In a lab study where researchers induce it and measure it happening. And some researchers who've looked closely at this argue that it's not just a gap waiting to be filled, but it's not easy because this process unfolds over months or years inside real relationships, not like 30-minute lab session. And it may simply belong to a different kind of inquiry than laboratory science is built for. So what exists is a body of qualitative research where psychotherapists have been interviewed in depth about their own experience of processing these dynamics in sessions. And researchers in fields like social work have studied the intense emotional reactions that supervisors have towards struggling students, using this concept as their theoretical lens. This is real empirical work, it's just not an experiment. And it's built from case material, interviews, observations over time. The same way a lot of our understanding of grief or trauma was built before it ever reached a randomized experimental study. So it's worth holding this as a well-documented clinical pattern observed and written about by people trained to notice it, rather than a mechanism that's been proven the way you'd prove something in a controlled experiment. There's also some critique of this idea that comes from within psychoanalysis itself, which is that it can be misused. If a therapist or any of us really starts explaining away every uncomfortable feeling as this isn't mine, this was put into me by the other person, that stops being our insight and it starts being a way to avoid responsibility for our own reactions. So the concept is only useful if it stays a question, not an excuse for our reactions. And if you want the more down-to-earth version of what might be happening, there is research on emotional suppression that points to something similar without needing any of the unconscious material to be in place. When people suppress how they're feeling, it doesn't just disappear internally. Their body stays physiologically activated, and that activation tends to leak out in tiny sometimes hard to name ways, like stiffness in posture, flatness in tone, a delay in response. And the people around a person like that often pick up on those signals and become more aroused, more tense, more reactive themselves without ever consciously registering why. So maybe what's happening with the person who never seems angry isn't some mysterious transfer of emotion. Maybe it's simply that their calm is costing them something physiologically, and you're close enough to feel the cost. I actually think both explanations can be true at the same time, because the psychoanalytic story gives us the meaning, the sense that a role is being filled, that something unspoken is being communicated. The suppression research gives us the mechanism, the actual biological channel through which that communication travels. So what do you actually do with this if you notice it happening to you? The first step is simply naming it to yourself. Of course, there's not accusing the other person or building theory about their psychology, just quietly noticing, I feel angrier around this person than the situation seems to explain. That noticing alone creates some amount of distance, and distance is powerful here because it means the feeling doesn't have to run your behavior and your communication with them. The second step is getting curious rather than immediately acting on the feeling. If you find yourself becoming the angry one in the relationship, it can be worth asking what would happen if that anger simply weren't there. Would it point to something that is not being said? Would it point to a need that is not being met, or a boundary that isn't being respected precisely because it's being expressed so quietly that it never gets acknowledged directly? And the third step, which is maybe the hardest, is recognizing that your anger, even if it was partly induced by this dynamic, might still be yours and still worth taking seriously. This concept we're talking about today is not a reason to dismiss your feelings as not belonging to you. It's a lens that can help you understand where some of the intensity is coming from, so you can respond thoughtfully instead of reactively. And so you can separate what's actually happening between you and this person from what might be an old pattern being replayed through you. In the end, what makes this concept so interesting, compelling, isn't that it explains difficult relationships. It's that it offers a more honest map of relationships. Some of what happens between people isn't in the words at all. It's in the shape of the interaction, the silences, the tone, the roles that get assigned without either person choosing them consciously. And once you can see that shape of the interaction, you're no longer just reacting to it. You're finally in a position to understand it. And once you see it, you can change it. So if that resonated with you, and if you had such experience with someone who was super calm and you constantly felt angry around them, please share in comments and also let me know how you coped with that. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.